The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Hello, everyone. I am back. Coach Tony Rich here. And welcome to another episode of the Endurance Experience. And this is the best of the Endurance Experience Podcast, Volume 5. It's hard to believe another season has come to the end. But before I get into all that, just want to apologize. I've been away for a little bit. The busiest time, or one of the busiest times of my season, is during the spring, as marathon and triathlon season starts to kick up. And the litany of my work kicks off with EventHorizon.tv in order to help athletes prepare for the upcoming training and racing season. So check us out too on EventHorizon.tv on all social media platforms. And so I've been away from the microphone, but also I am preparing for my next season. And that will be season 6 of the Endurance Experience. And so I've been planning for that, talking with guests or potential guests, and I have a good understanding of what the lineup will be, and then I will start recording soon. And it's looking like it's going to be a pretty great season if I can nail down some of the guests that I've been talking with. And I want some of your ideas. This is the time where I solicit ideas. You can send ideas to contact@eventhorizon.tv. Some of your ideas actually turned into guests for this past season. And it's getting very competitive out there. There are a lot of podcasts out there now. Depending upon which number you believe, there may be in the upwards of 2 million total podcasts out there now. And there's lots of competition. Everyone is starting to launch their own. So I'm looking for ideas as well on how to differentiate. So if you have some ideas on, some of the best elements of some of the other podcasts that you are listening to or watching, let me know. I'm interested. I have gotten feedback that people love the podcast and they love the conversations, but they just want more consistency. I'm working on that. That's a challenge, especially with someone like myself being pulled in different ways. But I think in my next season, I will consistently attempt to try to get 1 to 2 podcasts out consistently every month. And remember, it really helps the podcast if you go out on Apple Podcasts in your phone and rate and place a comment. It really does help out the show and the algorithm. Much appreciated. So if you remember some of the best of episodes in the past, this is where I take a sample from the 5 most downloaded and listened to podcasts of the season. I take a clip from those episodes and then provide updated commentary on them. And so new listeners can get a nice little sampling of what the podcast is all about. And if you've already listened to those podcasts, you can get my updated commentary. I want you to get a flavor for the science and evidence-based approach of the podcast, in the discussions, in the questions, and in the guests, the type of guests that we invite onto the podcast. And then, you can go back into the show notes, find the links, and then you can listen to those podcasts if you haven't already, or if you've already listened to them, you can go listen to it again. In the end, you'll have a nice jumping off point for Season 6, which I will start briefly thereafter this episode. So without further delay, let's see. What were the 5 most downloaded and listened to podcasts of Season 5? Here they are in the order in which they occurred. Episode 42, The Racing Weight Question with coach, nutritionist, and author Matt Fitgerald. I knew that was going to be a popular podcast. Matt is a very popular coach, well known, and that is a highly discussed topic. And then there was episode 43, Factors Impacting Swimming Participation and Competence, with Dr. Carol Irwin. She has been one of the lead researchers on swimming and why we see less swimming competence in underrepresented communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities, and such. And she talked about the research there. Episode 45, The Endurance Enthusiast's Heart, with Professor Graham Stuart. Another popular topic about endurance athletes and the impact of training and racing on the endurance athlete's heart. I think many athletes had some interest in that topic, and so many people tuned in and listened to that. Then there was episode 47, The Pseudoscience of Sport, Health, and Fitness, with Dr. Nick Tiller. He has a book out, which I highly recommend, The Skeptic's Guide to Sport Science. And we had a great conversation. And so that's very popular because I think people like the controversy of things that are being promoted on social media that may not have empirical underpinnings, let's just say. So we had a great conversation. And then episode 49, Coaching the Endurance Athlete, with Dr. Susan Sotir. We had a great conversation about a lot of topics, but particularly with the one that seemed to get a lot of traction was with some of the audiograms that I posted out on social media, was our conversation about coaching female athletes. And so that got a lot of activity. So those were the 5 that were the most downloaded and listened to in Season 5. And so I'm going to go through a clip from each one, starting with my conversation with Matt Fitgerald on the racing weight question. Matt wrote a book called Racing Weight, and I read it over a decade ago, and it was a great book that took me into new direction when trying to really figure out the science of things like nutrition, racing performance, body composition. And so I brought him on to talk about that work. And so in this clip, we talk about timing effects and how athletes should handle timing effects as it relates to nutrition, and the science underpinning body composition for particularly running.
I was an endurance athlete, an endurance coach, a sports nutritionist. And, what I saw at that time was, it's simply, an obvious fact that if you're pursuing performance as an endurance athlete, optimizing, your body composition and body weight is one piece of that puzzle. Mm-hmm. It's only one among many pieces. There are literally dozens. But to deny the fact that body weight and body composition impact endurance performance is foolish. And I was aware of this. The athletes I coached and trained with were aware of this. So there was a lot of conversation about. It was interesting. I I half jokingly referred to Racing Weight as the diet book for skinny people, because we weren't folks who just wanted to look good in the mirror naked. Like we wanted to PR and qualify for Boston and qualify for Kona. And what I saw was that athletes who were looking to optimize their performance through improvements in body composition and body weight were actually like choosing the popular fad diets, triathletes were going on the South Beach diet, which was not written by or for endurance athletes, for the sake of improving their endurance performance. And my thought was, that's no good.
Right.
There are good and bad ways to go about this. And so I wanted to, you said you come up with ideas for books and don't write them because I've written them already. Well, I'm not that different. My thought was like, there needs to be like a credible, authoritative, empirical resource that shows athletes, the right way to go about optimizing their body composition and body weight for endurance performance. I looked around, that resource didn't exist. So I wrote it.
With respect to timing your nutrition, the step 5, how do you recommend employing that? Do you mean, for instance, someone has a big training weekend, a big training block coming up, and perhaps they take a tactical approach to fueling on, say, Friday or Thursday coming up, leading up to that big training block? How do you recommend timing?
Yeah, the basic point is that when you eat matters almost as much as what you eat,
right?
And then you get down to the details and specifics from there. In terms of in tactical terms, calorie intake should be concentrated around periods of heightened calorie expenditure, right? So that for athletes, the most intensive periods of caloric expenditure are workouts and races. So fueling up before, fueling during as appropriate, and fueling up after for the recovery period. Not only will you tend to perform better in your workouts and thereby get more out of them, and also recover better afterwards by doing that.
I wonder if you could explain this to the listeners, the scientific basis behind this, why this is true for the endurance athlete. If someone came up to you and said, what's the scientific underpinning behind leaner bodies moving more efficiently in an endurance event? How would you answer the question?
Yeah, it's so it's a little bit physics and a little bit physiology. So running is a good example because in running you're moving against gravity. Like running is really just controlled jumping.
Right.
And so if you know your physics, you know that the more mass your body contains, the more you weigh, the more energy it takes to take a hop forward, from one foot to the next, as you do, repeatedly in running. If you run a marathon, that's 55,000 steps, each and every one of them against gravity. So, the more mass on your body, the more energy it takes, and you only have so much energy. So, you'll cover that distance a lot more quickly if you have less mass, to carry over that distance. So that's the physics part of it. The physiology part of it is that body fat is dead weight. Most other tissues of your body actually contribute to forward motion, muscles being the obvious example. Like, muscles weigh something. So there's a cost. You have to move your muscles just as much as you have to move any other tissue in your body. But your muscles are actually doing the work of moving you. It's like the engine of a car. So, and so you don't want to get rid of your muscle. but body fat makes no, beyond the minimal amount that's required just to be healthy. And body fat is active tissue. It's not completely dead weight, but it's not the same as muscle where
Right.
it moves you forward. It's a reserve energy source. So you need a certain amount of, like, body fat is not bad. You need a certain amount to be healthy and to train and to get from point A to point B. But beyond that, any excess beyond that, just it doesn't contribute to forward motion, and it adds to the cost of getting from point A to point B. So
Right.
for those reasons, in like a sport like swimming, there's no particular cost to being heavier. But still, elite swimmers tend to have a relatively low body fat percentage, because, like, the physics factor is a little different there, but the physiology factor is not. So those are the two basic reasons you want to be lean and light.
The link in the show notes to episode 42, the racing weight question with Matt Fitgerald. For athletes looking for a resource to maximize performance in this area, I would highly recommend Matt's book, Racing Weight. It is the book that, as he said in the clip, that needed to be written, so he wrote it, right? And so, with all the new heightened awareness around this topic, and we've seen recently where this can go wrong, where athletes and coaches employ extreme strategies in order to try to hack this element of training and ignore, like Matt said, the dozens of other variables that you need to focus on in the training process. We've seen it go wrong for sure. And I think what Matt's book shows is you can highlight the need for a science and evidence-based approach to this so that athletes can find the range of body compositions that maximize their performance. And it is a range. It's not just one target number on the scale. And I do mean body composition in the purest sense of that word, not only what's on the scale, but the functional strength an athlete needs to accomplish certain movements and tasks, as well as training and racing payloads. And you can employ a thoughtful strategy, a process-oriented strategy, into the other elements of your training, and eventually, with diligent and consistency, arrive at the place that you need to in order to maximize your performance and achieve your goals. And of course, your behaviors and strategies are going to scale with the category of athlete. A recreational athlete won't have the same behaviors and strategies of an athlete trying to run a sub 3-hour marathon or qualify for the Ironman World Championship. So I think what has happened with this issue is, because all of the heightened awareness around extreme nutrition strategies and abuse of these strategies, what it has done is it has caused many coaches to swing completely in the opposite direction. And many of them are now so paralyzed with fear to even consider or discuss the topic of nutrition and body composition as an element of maximizing their training. And that can't be helpful either, because coaches are hired to get results. They're hired to get results. They're hired to help athletes, be truthful to them, and use science and evidence-based approaches wherever they can. And it really doesn't matter even what type of athlete you are, whether you're a defensive lineman, a swimmer, a boxer, or a racer of any stripe, a thrower, in any type of sport, athletes have to consider nutrition and body composition in their array of variables that they can target and ideally maximize. And the last thing to say about this that athletes should remember is form follows function. And I've heard Matt say this, I think it was in his books. Your form will follow your function, right? So be process oriented, train hard, have a strategy behind your nutrition, and your form will follow. Don't get too wrapped up into getting to some number on the scale. Believe it or not, your body has an amazing way of figuring out where it needs to be to do the things you're trying to make it do. And genetics does play a pretty significant role. I think in my heyday, when I was the fastest I've ever been, I was able to get close to the 3-hour marathon mark. I could never really actually hit it or get to sub 3-hour marathon. And I realized that because of my muscular frame and my genetics built like a sprinter, that would be a little bit out of reach for me. And I was fine with that. And sometimes you need to say, maybe I just do the best that I can with the attributes that I have and be fine with that. And sometimes you just have to do that. I recently coached an athlete named Chris, and he came to me, wanted to do his first Ironman. And Chris had some pretty powerful genetic attributes that I realized from the start. Many of you are familiar with the 3 somatypes. Somatypes are basically body composition types: mesomorph, endomorph, and ectomorph. And Chris came to me as a classic ectomorph. Very tall, very lean, probably slow twitch muscle fiber, long, slow twitch muscle fiber disposition. And immediately I told him, I said, you're gonna do well in this sport. And he ended up in his first Ironman, qualified for the Ironman World Championship. He wasn't trying to do that. He just did it. And then he came back in a few weeks after that, and ran his first Boston Marathon and ran a sub 3-hour Boston Marathon, first Boston Marathon. And so I knew that, don't get me wrong, I had him train diligently for sure, but it was because that he had such a favorable predisposition, his factory settings gave him such a favorable predisposition to do that. So do the best you can with the attributes you have a systematic, process-oriented approach. Don't get too wrapped around the axle about the scale. Train hard and let your form follow your function. On to the next clip. So my episode 43 was on factors impacting swimming participation and competence with Dr. Carol Irwin. And she was a part of a team of researchers, including her husband, who researched this issue for several USA swimming research studies. The aim is to try to figure out why we see such low swimming proficiency in underserved populations, particularly African American populations. North of 2/3 of African Americans show low or no swimming ability. In this clip, Dr. Irwin and I are discussing some of the findings of the May 2020 qualitative report, factors impacting swimming participation and competence. This was a very popular podcast and one of the most downloaded, so let's listen in. Not only as a general issue, I mean, generally we see that adults don't know how to swim, and particularly if they didn't grow up swimming, but it's almost a much more pervasive case in the instance of minorities swimming. And just this summer in the Northeast, we had a young kid drown, and then a police officer drowned trying to save the young kid.
Oh, wow.
And the police officer, I think, was a Hispanic police officer. So let's start right in talking about the research, and if you can, talk about how you formulated the study, maybe talk about the problem statement that you and your fellow researchers took on, and factors impacting swimming participation, and what are some of the key statistics that will drive home the understanding of the problem to the listeners?
Sure. Originally, back in 2008 and 2010, we kind of uncovered a few major issues. We entered into this research with, the general kind of like, well, I know why African Americans don't learn how to swim. It's because of X or Y or Z. And it's like, well, that's fine. And, we'll ask a bunch of other people to make sure that that's a pretty solid possibility. And so we included a lot of those, maybe this is an issue kind of situation in the 2008 survey. And what we came up with out of the 2008 and then verified it with the 2010 study was that really the major problem was fear of drowning. And especially with the underserved communities, underserved children. And that became a factor because their parents told them to stay away from water because their parents didn't know how to swim.
Yeah.
And that is something that as a WSI, I remember watching great fear of parents sitting in the bleachers watching their kids learning to swim because they were helpless. They couldn't, if they saw their child go underwater, there was, probably no way they could save that child because number one, they couldn't swim and they wouldn't get there in time. So it was there's a big fear factor with drowning and injury, especially in the underserved Black communities, Hispanic communities. And it's really just a pervasive legacy of fear.
Yeah, I can attest to that. And just in my own experience, and, as they say, N equals one, I'm just one observation, but there's a cultural component for sure. Absolutely. And, as a youth, it never even dawned on me that swimming would be something fun to do as a Black kid growing up. I was concerned with basketball and I was concerned with football. These were the things that we did because we were good at it.
Well, and it was fun.
It's fun. Yeah.
And, whereas swimming, it can be fun too, but it's also, I think, a life skill. I think every child should learn how to swim, very much like every child should learn how to cross the street. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's that cultural component. So,
sure.
And the other thing is, and we can talk about it later, about how money comes into play, time comes into play, right? Because Red Cross has a program, YMCA has a program, but those programs are not free. And then how does that play into it? So I want to get into that at some point. But before that, let's talk about the research in the May 2020 study. how did you build off of all of the previous work that was done in 2008, 2010, and what was the aim, and how did this qualitative report build off of the previous work? And then if you can comment on what are the limitations, if there are any.
Sure. The 2017 study was USA Swimming came to us and said, we want to check to see how underserved and at-risk youth are dealing with, the information that was gleaned in 2010. And plus on top of it, USA Swimming wanted to check their own programming, that they had put a lot of money in from donors to teach kids that needed to learn how to swim. So that was one part of it. But they also said, we want to check also middle income rather than just low income. We want to check to see how they are learning how to swim. That group is handling the situation. And it was very fascinating to compare the middle income or upper income. There was it was a little bit above what median income was our groups that we were able to get and compare them to the lower income. And, they were taking their babies into the water and dunking them and, getting them to learn how to swim at a very, very young age and trying to matriculate them into a swim team. Right. So their pathway into learning how to swim were a lot different than others. So it was kind of fascinating. And to be honest with you, that's how I taught my children to learn how to swim. I took them into the pool when they were infants and blew on their faces and dunked them down underneath the water. But that's because I was a WSI and I had learned, other kind of techniques to teach very young kids. So obviously kids, middle income and up, were learning how to swim. So there was a huge income factor that we kind of uncovered with that situation in regards to comparison. We knew there was an income issue from the 2010, but just talking to people in focus groups, the truth comes out in focus groups. And it was just completely revealing. So that it was a good check.
And which cities were involved in the focus groups?
The cities in 2017 were Houston, Las Vegas, Jacksonville, and Memphis. We had a little bit of Los Angeles, but they kind of backed out towards the end. We had some surveys. But the focus groups were those four cities: Houston, Las Vegas, Jacksonville, and Memphis.
And so then you have a set of questions that, and then you pose those surveys to did they know what the study was about? For instance, is it blind to that, or did you talk to the survey participants on what the study was about?
Right. What we did is we would go to each city and we would train YMCA staff to do the survey distribution and collection on their own. So we told them to go ahead and tell them we're trying to learn more about swimming and what people go through and do they continue swimming. And so they were very honest about it. And they were very good about it too. And we trained them in regards to if someone feels like some of these questions are too sensitive, to just say, skip that question, or if you want to stop, you can stop. And really the only sensitive part on the surveys were basically designating what racial category you fell into. Right. But we also gave them options to not check the box, but then describe, what your racial description is on your own part if you want to. So we ended up with, let me see, I think about 1,400 surveys from just those four cities, which was amazing. The YMCA staff did a great job of being able to get as many as they could, which is great.
Right. And so you have the scale here. And so imagine a sort of what they call a Likert scale, so on one end of the scale, you have, I avoid getting near / in water other than to bathe. And then all the way at the end of the scale is, I can swim many lengths without stopping on a swim team, or could be on a team, or could be on a swim team. And then there are many points in between. So that, I think, is a helpful way to do it, because oftentimes when you ask someone, can they swim, their definition of swim is different from yours.
Right.
Right.
I remember vividly in Houston in the 2008 study. Houston, we repeated Houston just to kind of check too, to see if it was similar, which it was, which was good. But in the 2008 study, I can remember going into an after school care at a middle school that the YMCA ran. And the staff member, we just kind of sat in the back, and the staff member said, okay, we're going to do a survey about swimming. How many of y'all can swim? And everybody raised their hands. And she did a great job. She said, I know you can't swim. I know you can't swim. She started pointing out at all these people that had raised their hand. And she said, there is a breakdown of levels of swimming in this, and you have to be honest. You have to promise me that you will be honest on this and tell the truth on this survey. So yes, you're right. Everybody thinks they can swim, even if it's just splashing around in the shallow end.
Yeah. What's some of the other limitations in this? I can't think of many, but if you have a swimming scale for them to gauge themselves, and I think the only other, I think you mentioned that there's some questions that someone may prefer not to answer, but I can't see many other additional limitations.
Yeah, it was pretty easy. It was survey research. And like I said, we were very open to, like, you don't want to answer that question, don't answer it. But we encourage you to keep going and finish up the rest of it. And we try to encourage them about how there's an, overabundance of drownings that occur in certain communities, and especially communities of color. And we want to stop that. We want to figure out how to respond to that by, getting kids to learn how to swim rather than just never learning how to swim and be at risk. So we tried to, get the staff, as well as we did a lot of surveys in Memphis and a few other places. So we tried real hard to make sure that we just want to find out, how you feel about swimming truthfully. Just have to be truthful.
Right. So it says in your report, over the years, most swimming performance results changed for the better, including all participants. Approximately 61.4 reported no or low swimming skill level in 2010. The results from the most recent study showed that 49.3% of the sample indicated they had no or low swimming level. So that dropped overall, which is good. But then when you look at specific racial or ethnic groups in 2010, the no or low swimming levels for African-American children were 68.9% as compared to 66.5% from the 2017 sample. So
there wasn't much improvement there, was there?
Exactly. So not much improvement. That means that over 2/3, approximately close to 2/3 of African-American children report low or no swimming ability. And that is a staggering number. It
is. And, I was happy to see that it improved. Compared to the 2010 study, but, and it improved on almost all categories. which we told USA Swimming, this is good. Your programs are working. You just have to be patient and, work in other communities that need help too. So they were pretty happy with that. But you're right. You think that every child should learn how to swim, in their a make-believe world, I guess.
Right.
But then we just got to keep working towards that.
Link is in the show notes to that full episode. I wasn't surprised that episode with Dr. Irwin received a lot of attention. I think this question of why we don't see black swimmers is a smaller subset of a larger conversation happening about disparities and the reason that the disparities exist. As Dr. Irwin said at the beginning of the clip, when we do empirical evaluation and scientific study, we try to stay away from the beliefs of, I know for a fact why this is the case. It's because of, as she said, X, Y, and Z. This highly speculative pull towards feelings and beliefs, and those can be helpful too. All science starts with some form of hypothesis, and as she said, we definitely want to look and evaluate those hypotheses. But then we come to, how do we understand better where the issues lie? And to do that, we take a fundamental empirical approach in order to try to evaluate and quantify what we can in order to draw conclusions. And in my empirical and science-centered mind, that's the best way to go about trying to understand it and perhaps trying to come up with actionable ways that you can turn the disparity around. So I'll tell you a story. I once got it a few years ago. I got into a conversation with a fellow swim coach in a social media swim coach group. And the guy, a white guy, basically said, well, I know why this disparity exists. It exists because back in the 40s and the 50s and in that era, black people weren't allowed in swimming pools. And so that created a sort of reverberation that exists all the way to today. And he was speaking with such brazen confidence, which, by the way, his claim is a true claim. We can go verify this claim. But the claim doesn't say much when black people were prohibited from doing quite a lot of things, including playing basketball, baseball, and football. So, needless to say, I'm highly skeptical at broad brush, widespread, catch-all claims that basically just appeal to emotion. So I did challenge his assertion and caveat it with, we can't exclude the possibility that that was some factor. I mean, all things are usually multifactorial. But this is the era that we are in. We're in an era of speculation, appeal to emotion, appeal to even controversy. What Dr. Irwin and her fellow researchers have showed us with their highly evaluative and empirical approach over more than a decade researching this issue, what it shows is that it's much more complicated. It has to do with cultural preferences, beliefs about swimming, fear. It has to do with, there is a monetary component. So you can absolutely make some quantifiable justifications that might lead to some, socioeconomic underpinnings. And like I said, I can overlay all of the empirical research with my admitted N=1 personal anecdotal experience just by growing up as a black kid in a black community. I had no interest at all in swimming. My sports were basketball, football, and track and field. I did them because I wanted to. They were fun. I was good at them. Or I thought I was good at them. But those were also the cheap things. It cost nothing to go to the court and play basketball or to run or to throw a football around. So there was absolutely some form of economic factors when you don't have money. Now, if my mother, say, was an avid swimmer or grew up as an avid swimmer, yeah, maybe, perhaps that may have rubbed off on me. Dr. Irwin's research and survey results, I definitely think, supports this. I just think we cannot discount the power of cultural preferences, whether it's basketball, hockey, football, lacrosse, or figure skating. And again, I told my story on this podcast. I started swimming somewhere around the age of 30. And I started swimming just because I wanted to do something called the Ironman Triathlon. Walked into a local YMCA and started taking lessons. And that's the same YMCA that I ended up going back and setting a Guinness World Record for the indoor Ironman. I became a master swim coach and lifeguard, waterfront lifeguard, water safety instructor, all certified with Red Cross. So the lesson that I draw from this is, first thing, if you didn't grow up swimming, it's not a lifetime swimming death sentence. You have enough time to become a really good swimmer. Second, for non-swimmers, just walk into a local YMCA and take a beginner swim course and learn how to swim. It's a life skill. Even if you're not training for a triathlon, I think you should learn. And I'm talking about real swimming. I'm talking about horizontal body in the water, face in the water, rotary breathing, consistent kick and stroking for 50 to 150 yards without stopping. That's swimming, not the stuff that you do at the beach. And finally, get your kids into swimming early. Lifeguards, start at age 16. If you get your kids into swimming early, they can become lifeguards as a side job early. And YMCA, Red Cross, both have programs that start as early as 6 months all the way up until swim team. And even if you don't have the financial means, there are grants and scholarships from YMCA and Red Cross. I will continue to look at whether or not new empirical evidence from Dr. Irwin's team of researchers and other researchers shed any more light on this and see if the statistics are turning around, because the drownings in underserved populations, young and old, have to improve. Let's go on to the next clip. Episode 45, The Endurance Enthusiast's Heart. The conversation with Professor Graham Stuart. He's a congenital heart cardiologist. And we had a broad conversation about a number of different things, including what's happening with the endurance athlete's heart during an actual endurance event. That was an interesting description. But this clip here is from our discussion about the impact of consistent endurance training and racing on an endurance athlete over a long time. Every couple of years, some article comes out about this. So I asked him about that. and I asked him about sudden deaths in endurance events. A few times a year, an athlete will die in a triathlon, usually in the swim. And I asked him about that, the underpinnings of some of the research behind why it happens. And he even offers his expert advice on some of the wearable technology that detects things like atrial fibrillation. So let's talk now about the long-term effects of training, endurance exercise like marathons, Ironman, distance triathlons, and then the training that comes with it. Every couple of years, I see some articles from different cardiology departments about the adverse effects. So I'm wondering now, has the evidence changed? What is the collective body of knowledge from cardiology saying about the long-term effects, and can we understand any sort of threshold of lifetime training that is either good or bad?
Well, I mean, the first point to make, Tony, is that there's absolutely no doubt that taking part in exercise is good for your health. So it's easy to get carried away with the downside, and there are some downsides, but by and large, they're overwhelmingly swamped by the benefits. So you reduce your likelihood of bowel cancer, breast cancer, you reduce your likelihood of heart attack, you reduce your likelihood of dementia, a whole host of improve your mental health, a whole host of things that are actually very, very good. The question, I suppose, is, first of all, what does exercise do? Well, there's a specific effect in the heart, but it also affects other areas of the body. So from the cardiovascular standpoint, there's the heart itself, there's the blood vessels, and there's the skeletal muscles. And the skeletal muscles become more efficient if you exercise. So there's these little energy-producing organs called mitochondria in the skeletal muscles. And if you exercise, they become bigger and they become more numerous. And so my research, a lot of that is people whose hearts are maybe 2-chambered rather than 4-chambered. They're not going to get better, but if they get their skeletal muscles more efficient, they'll be able to do more with the same heart. So big skeletal muscle benefits. Blood vessel benefits, when you go out, run up the stairs, your hands and feet get warm. That's because the blood vessels dilate. And by regular exercising, they get better at dilating. The vessels are less stiff. Now, all our blood vessels get stiffer as we get older. So exercise can preserve the youthfulness of your blood vessels, if you like, which is a really good thing. From the heart itself, one of the things you'll notice for people particularly doing endurance exercise, they tend to have a slower heart rate. And the reason, there's several reasons really, but the output of the heart is calculated by looking at the heart rate and looking at what's called the stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped out for every heartbeat. And as the heart gets bigger, it doesn't need to pump out so frequently at rest, heart rate slows. And it does that through a couple of mechanisms, one of which is increasing vagal tone, which is the vagus nerve that slows the heart rate. So if you get a whole bunch of endurance athletes to sit down, you give them a lecture, get them all to stand up, quite a few will feel dizzy. And that's a very, very common phenomenon in endurance athletes. And that's because their heart rate takes a while to speed back up again. And that's mostly vagal tone. But also, we've learned a lot recently that there's a thing called downregulation of the funny channels of the heart, the IKF channels. And that's why some extreme endurance athletes, maybe the Tour de France cyclists, may have heart rates in the high 20s or low 30s, and that's downregulation of the IKF channels. Mm-hmm. So these are the main consequences of normal physiological consequences of training. In terms of adverse effects, one of the few adverse effects in endurance exercise is an increased risk of a rhythm called atrial fibrillation. And that's where the top chambers of the heart go into a very rapid, irregular rhythm. And that's 4 or 5-fold increased in long-term endurance athletes.
Wow.
And it's a very common rhythm as you get older anyway. Something 1%, 2% of 60-year-olds, 5% of 65-year-olds, 10% of 70-year-olds have this sort of rhythm. But it's higher in endurance athletes. And there's many, many potential explanations for this, but it certainly is true, is the case.
How does that translate into something actionable for the endurance athlete as far as training is concerned, right? So, the average recreational athlete or even slightly competitive athlete, you might train, if you're training for an Ironman, you might train, in a week, you might train maybe an hour a day, or maybe a couple of hours a day if you're really competitive. Is there any sort of upper limit to training? A professional athlete might do several hours a day. So, but then I guess also it might come down to time, right? If you're a professional athlete, you might only do that for maybe 6 to 10 years. I'm trying to figure out the magnitude of training to where it might become more adverse than not.
Well, there is a sweet spot. In terms of cardiovascular mortality or all-cause mortality, the sweet spot is round about 10 or 11 hours a week. And so there's a U-shaped mortality curve. So if you're doing nothing, then your mortality is right up there.
Right.
As you do more and more exercise, it keeps falling until you're doing round about 10 or 11 hours a week. Once you go past that, it starts to climb again. Slowly. So by the time you're doing 21 hours, it's nowhere near as high as if you were completely sedentary, but it's higher than if you're doing 10 or 11 hours. And again, the reasons for this are not entirely clear. That's an observation, an epidemiological observation, but atrial fibrillation might be one component of that. And the way an athlete will know they're in atrial fibrillation, usually it's something that affects middle-aged athletes rather than younger athletes. It's rare in young athletes. It affects particularly the bigger athletes. There's a relationship with body size. So the taller you are, the more likely you are to get atrial fibrillation. And there's also a genetic element. If both your parents have had it and you're an endurance athlete, you have a significantly higher chance of getting it. And a lot of the things like the Apple Watch and the Samsung Watch, the ECG watches, one of their modalities is to pick up atrial fibrillation.
Yeah, and so Apple Watch has this. There's one called Cardia that I use, and they also they'll detect different arrhythmias. Something called bradycardia and tachycardia. So, do you think that these are effective tools from a cardiologist standpoint?
Yeah. I mean, there's some. If it costs you £30, you get it from the internet. It will not work. The ones like Cardia, you've mentioned the Apple Watch, there's Samsung, there's Fitbit. They all have they use very similar technology and they work. You've got to be careful in the interpretation that they will give you automatically. So, I use them a lot with athletes, and quite often I'll recommend athletes get them. If somebody's having intermittent flutters of the heart rate, and it's only when they're exercising, one of the best ways of documenting that is to have a Apple Watch or a Charge 5 band that monitors atrial fibrillation. And then you can actually store a PDF of the rhythm, not just the heart rate, but the actual rhythm, and send it to your cardiologist and they can confirm it. But so I test all these devices when they come out to see if they work. Because when athletes come to me with it, I like to see what the accuracy is. And so I'm currently using the Charge 5, and it's automatically an analysis of my rhythm always says inconclusive. And that's because it's below 50 a minute, because I've done long-term endurance exercise. That doesn't mean it's abnormal. They just say inconclusive. So an athlete that relies solely on the algorithm to know what it means may think they've got an abnormal rhythm, whereas that would be an entirely normal rhythm for somebody doing a lot of exercise.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that's a good sign that this wearable technology is working. It's giving at least good information that you could supplant with actual doctors' recommendations. And so, how about we talk now about so periodically in whether it be triathlon or marathon events. We will see athletes will suddenly die in an event. And in triathlon, it's usually during the swim. But it's not a lot. It's not a lot. We're not talking about big numbers per year. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but periodically you'll hear about it. And when this happens, do we know generally what the cause is? Maybe it's adverse reactions from atrial fibrillation or some other pre-existing conditions. Do we know generally when this happens, why it happens?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, atrial fibrillation is unlikely to cause sudden death, which is the good news. It can cause other things, the worst of which is strokes, but by and large, it'd be unlikely in itself. The vast majority of people who die suddenly in that context have an undetected, unsuspected underlying heart problem. So it might be an electrical problem, it might be a structural problem. There's so-called cardiomyopathies, fancy heart muscle doesn't work, but that's one of the common causes. So that is the rationale for doing pre-participation screening. So certainly in the United Kingdom, every teenage footballer who gets a professional contract will have an ECG and an echocardiogram. And the idea is to pick up the detectable conditions that may prove dangerous on exercise. The problem with the pre-participation screening is it doesn't pick up everything. So last week we had a British footballer with a cardiac arrest on the football pitch, and he will have had several screens. So it's not perfect. But usually it's due to an undetected underlying heart problem. For the older athletes, heart attacks, coronary artery disease are quite an important cause. And there is genetics versus environment. And if your father and your uncle had a heart attack at age 42, even if you're a non-smoker and you have had your cholesterol checked, you are then at increased risk of a heart attack. Exercise will reduce that risk, but it won't necessarily remove it completely. And James Fix, the famous endurance runner, he tragically died of a heart attack, yet being a long-term marathon runner. And that can happen.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that if you've done events, many events, I mean, athletes will have race histories, or they've done many marathons, many Ironman. Is it fair to say that if you've done those, you would have exposed something if there was a problem, or is that not a?
Sadly, that's not always true. So, for example, I mean, if I look at the soccer world, we've had famous soccer players who've had cardiac arrests having played professionally for 20 years.
Yeah.
It's not always true. And what's difficult sometimes is to tease out what it was specifically about a particular game, a particular event that made it worse. There are some guidelines, though. So, for example, if you are feeling unwell, if you have a viral type illness, if your muscles are achy, you should not go out training. And that's because some of these viruses affect the heart muscle, and you won't be aware of that, particularly the ones that cause stomach upsets. And so that's why you shouldn't train when you're unwell. There's other factors. So, for example, some of the stimulant drinks that are marketed to improve endurance, you've got to be very careful with them, particularly if there's lots of caffeine, and they're banned in some countries, like Germany, for example, because initiate an abnormal heart rhythm.
This was a very popular podcast in season 5. I would highly recommend you go check it out. if you haven't listened to it already, Professor Stuart was the perfect one to have this conversation with. He has such a broad research agenda in cardiology, but also he himself is an endurance athlete, Ironman distance triathlete, as well as a runner, an accomplished rower as well. So this is a topic that, not only as a coach I'm interested in, but also as an athlete, right? So as you approach middle age and your race count is climbing and climbing, endurance athletes of all stripes who want to continue to do these activities into later ages should keep an eye on the research and the technology in this space. At the same time, we don't want to have too much of an alarmist perspective. Like Professor Stuart said in the clip, the benefits of exercise over the long term far outweigh the risks of endurance exercise over the long term, and the likelihood of some pre-existing condition not being caught and someone has a fatality during a endurance event. Those are minuscule numbers compared to the millions, really tens of millions of people who complete these events every year and do them well into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes 70s and 80s. As the endurance events are getting very popular, or have gotten very popular over the last few decades, cardiologists now have big data sets to look at and evaluate. Many people were captivated by Damar Hamlin, the Buffalo Bills safety, who had to have CPR done after suffering a cardiac arrest right in the middle of a Monday Night Football game on national TV. And so that issue really stuck with a lot of athletes of all stripes. People started to say, yeah, well, maybe I should talk to my doctor and just have some tests done just to make sure. I have a primary care physician that I've had for probably over 25 years. In addition to her, I also have a cardiologist, and she's one of the best cardiologists in the country. And that's under the context of there's absolutely nothing wrong. That's the common misconception, that there has to be something quote-unquote wrong for you to go and get tests and check the story, right? I have a marathon count nearing 100 already, and it's just something that you do as a precautionary measure as you cross certain life thresholds. Recall what Professor Stuart said about the U-shaped mortality curve. As you start to exercise, mortality rate begins to drop. But then when it bottoms at 10 to 11 hours, it starts to creep back up again. And some people actually call it a J mortality curve because the mortality never really climbs back up to levels where you were completely sedentary. So that's why some people call it a J mortality curve. And so that's the value proposition of exercise generally, but it's something to keep an eye on. I did get an Apple Watch, and I got one just because of the feature where you can do an ECG, and these wearable technologies will detect atrial fibrillation. So on that note, I feel that it's valuable to get. I still train with Garmin, but some of these new wearable technologies do have potentially critical detection mechanisms, as you heard from Professor Stuart. I mean, nothing can replace your primary care physician's advice or your cardiologist's advice, but if these tools can give even one small added information benefit that you could share with your doctor or cardiologist, hey, it's worth the money. Okay, let's move on to the next clip. Episode 47, The Pseudoscience of Sport, Health, and Fitness, with Professor Nick B. Tiller. He's a senior researcher in exercise physiology at Harbor UCLA and the author of The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. This was a great episode. I highly recommend you pick up Professor Tiller's book. And we talked about his book, and it's one of those books that I will continue to recommend and even give as gifts. I told him on the podcast. So we talk about unproven claims that are pervasive in health and wellness. He was the perfect person to have this conversation with. Not only is he a PhD, an authority on physiology and pathophysiology, but he's also an endurance enthusiast, an ultramarathoner, as well as an Ironman triathlete. So let me just play the clip. It was hard to pick out just one clip, but this one was on popular alternative therapies that athletes take up, like acupuncture, cupping, and so on. Probably know a lot of people in the endurance community. You tell an endurance enthusiast that something will work or decrease their time by a minute or two, the money will be burning a hole in their pocket to pay for it. It doesn't have to have any evidence. They just need to believe that it's going to, decrease their time by a minute, 2 minutes, or it's going to help them recover faster, or so on and so forth. And when then the Michael Phelps thing happened, when he gets on, on TV in international Olympic competition with the circle, the broken blood vessels in his back, I said, "Oh my goodness."
Well, and actually, we did an analysis of this and looked at the Wikipedia page hits, the traffic to the Wikipedia entry on cupping therapy. And before Phelps's appearance at the 2016 Games, it was kind of trucking along at maybe 1,500 hits a day. And the day after the Olympic finals, it spiked to well over 100,000. Everybody wanting to know what cupping therapy was all about. And, you'd have seen it yourself. It was featured on the news, in magazines. What are these big purple circles on Phelps's shoulders? And now you see all sorts of swimmers and different athletes trying this thing, despite the fact that it's not evidence-based.
Yeah.
And this, it just goes to show that people, the perception of something working is more important than the evidence. As long as if it's good enough for Phelps, and it's good enough for everyone else. Yeah.
Let's step into that now, since it came up in the talk about placebos. Acupuncture, cupping, these are all what they call complementary alternative medicine.
Yeah.
Now, you can give me your thoughts on where this came from. It's my understanding that these sort of stem from the same idea of chi, or sort of an ancient prana.
Sure.
Help us unpack what it is, and some of the what you've talked about, the potentially harmful parts or unethical parts of it.
Yeah, sure. There are lots of different sort of subcategories of, I guess the umbrella term would be alternative. I guess the umbrella term would be placebo medicine. You have alternative medicine, complementary or alternative therapies. Complementary and alternative medicine, you refer to energy medicine, this idea that there's some kind of energy, the ancient Chinese concept of qi, which is energy flow. And a lot of the complementary and alternative medicines, or CAMs, are based on this idea of energy medicine. So acupuncture, for example, the original incarnations were based on this idea that there are meridians in the body where energy flows. And if you get some kind of ailment or soreness or pain, it's because one of these meridians has been blocked. So you would put needles into the acupuncture site to help the energy to continue to flow. Chiropractic is not an energy medicine. It's not an ancient Chinese medicine. It's actually much more recent than that. It was developed in the sort of mid-1900s. And that is supposedly based on more modern thinking, but it's still it's what we call a pseudoscience, because it takes sort of, it sounds scientific, and it's sort of mimicking scientific principles and the scientific method, but actually it doesn't hold up to scrutiny when it's explored in more detail. And Other things like other energy medicines, for example, would be Reiki or healing hands, which is what Mr. Miyagi was very, very good at in The Karate Kid.
Right.
He would put his hands
Slap his
together and
hands
rub his
together
hands.
and rub
That's
it,
it, yeah. And this is all based on sort of ancient Asian medicine. So there are lots of different subcategories, and we wouldn't be able to cover them all.
Yeah.
But very broadly, they can all be considered pseudosciences because they are subverting normal practice. They are impersonating real science, claiming to be evidence-based, but actually any scientist who is worth his or her salt will know very quickly that this stuff is not the real deal.
Right. Yeah. That I've seen this so much over the years. Acupuncture, dry needling. My response is always, it doesn't have any strong empirical evidence. If you want to do it because you think it feels like a massage and it makes you feel good, maybe there's some second order effect, like it reduces stress hormone, maybe. But I have to be honest and say, this is me speaking to athletes, that it doesn't have strong empirical foundation. And
acupuncture is an interesting one because, as I said, the original incarnations were based on energy medicine and blocked energy meridians, but it was decided a little while ago that these principles are sort of outdated and don't really conform to the modern world, where we've got access to so much information and people weren't so much interested in energy medicine. So then they came up with dry needling, which is acupuncture proponents' attempt to basically bring it into the new age, try and make it sound more sciencey, but essentially it's the same practice.
Yeah.
And again, the evidence for dry needling is very weak. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of studies that have been looking at the effect of acupuncture, and there's a lot of noise in the data, but when you look at the better, more well-controlled study, the effects are non-distinguishable from placebo. And people always come back with the idea that, well, it worked for me.
Well, it worked for me.
I went and tried it and I felt better afterwards.
Yeah.
And this is a fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's an informal logical fallacy. It's in its base form, in its most basic manifestation. It's you have an ancient tribe and it's and they go out and they do a rain dance around a fire, and then the next day it rains. And they assume that the dance has caused the rain. Well, maybe it would have rained anyway. So it's the assumption that correlation is the same as causation. And again, it's about understanding bias and how we're likely to commit it.
Right. And I've seen, two ways I've seen them test acupuncture. One way is with they sort of randomize where they put the needles, right? So the so-called expert will say, these are where the meridians are. Mm-hmm. So say, okay, we'll do a control where we'll just stick them in random places.
Sure.
That's the control, because if the meridians were true, you would get something very different, a different result if you just randomized and put them in any random place. That's one way they tested, and that didn't really show any difference, right? So that's the control. The other way was what's called sham, where the needle sort of retracts at the last minute. So the needle gives the indication that it goes in, but it doesn't really go in. It just sort of retracts at the last minute. And if that's the control, so if in fact you saw something different for that control group where the needle doesn't go in, that would be very interesting. But it also, similarly, there was no difference, right?
Yeah, and that's the essence of good science, is if you have these good placebo-controlled studies, or they call them sham-controlled, as you just alluded to.
Right.
And so the listeners have to understand that it's very easy to give a group of people acupuncture, ask them if they feel better, and they say, yeah, I feel better, because you're not controlling for the placebo effects.
Right.
Okay, well, if you get two groups of people, you give one group acupuncture, you give another group acupuncture, which is exactly as you've said, it feels like acupuncture, it looks like it, but actually the needles are placed in the wrong place, or the needles are retracted at the last second. And in those better controlled, more high quality studies, there's no difference between the two groups,
right?
Because you're accounting for the placebo effects.
Yeah.
And when you have an N of 1, and you have one individual who's getting acupuncture and they feel better, you're not accounting for placebo. You're not accounting for the expectation and belief. So that's why controlled scientific studies are so important.
Link in the show notes to that full episode. We get into some conversations about just about all of the most frequent myths of the health and fitness industry. Now, if you take a look at social media these days, the cacophony of silliness that's out there is just mind-bending. The frequency of all of the armchair experts are just numerous. And much of it from people with no qualifications or expertise or real expertise. So this podcast was just in the nick of time. So if you're an avid listener of this podcast, I know I'm pushing at an open door. You all know that I'm scientifically centered. So I've always said that training, recovery, nutrition, athlete psychology, everything that you do related to fitness, health, and wellness, all of it it should be grounded in the best science available. Why? Because we know science works on average. The clip underscores why it's necessary to do scientific research, empirical research, to make sure that what you're subscribing to has efficacy beyond placebo effect. And the common retort, well, I know that for a fact that it worked for me. Well, you're a sample size of one. And so you can't really say that you know with certainty that something worked. Something has to be put through rigorous scientific study with samples large enough, with control groups, and the gold standard is double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials to get high-quality understanding of whether or not something has efficacy. So sometimes people say, look, what's the big deal? If it works, I think it works for me. Even if it's a placebo effect, I go off and then I get my placebo effect. No harm is done to anyone. Perhaps, but the flip side is people, because of this seducing down the pathway to alternative medicine, they forego traditional and potentially life-saving medicine. We recently mourned the death of Tina Turner, a world icon. She lived to be 83 years old, so she lived a pretty long life. But she had an interview this March, and essentially she had to get a kidney transplant, and she was plagued with lifelong hypertension that was left untreated. Why is this relevant to the topic? Well, you're going to find out very quickly when I read People magazine article that came out after she passed away on May 25th, 2023. This is Tina Turner talking in the interview. She says, I can't remember ever getting an explanation about what high blood pressure means or how it affects the body, she said. I considered high blood pressure my normal, hence I didn't really try to control it. With her condition left untreated, Turner suffered a stroke in 2013, and that's when she learned her kidneys didn't work that well anymore. She began taking prescription medication to get her hypertension under control, though the pills made her feel even worse. She took matters into her own hands and went to a homeopathic doctor in France. Later, during her next checkup, the results were shocking. I had not known that uncontrolled hypertension would worsen my renal disease and that I would kill my kidneys by giving up on controlling my blood pressure, she said. I never would have replaced my medication by the homeopathic alternatives if I had had an idea how much was at stake for me. Thanks to my naivete, I had ended up at the point where it was about life or death, she continued. So this recent example, and this is just one example of how one can get seduced down the pathway and why the answer to the question of, hey, what's the big deal, is so important. She lived to be 83. She lived a long life. Maybe we would have had her for another decade or two. Maybe she would have lived a life with less suffering as a result of the renal failure. We don't know. And we don't know why she never got good advice about the risks, lifelong risks of hypertension. But we do know that somewhere along the way, she was convinced that homeopathy, alternative medicine, was a good idea when we know that homeopathy is a scam. There is no active ingredient in the homeopathic remedy. If you listened long enough, you've heard me say, I think, alternative medicine that's backed by strong empirical evidence has a name. It's called medicine. It's funny, people never go to an alternative car mechanic or fly on a plane from an alternative pilot, or if they're in legal trouble, go to an alternative lawyer. The scientific method is the best tool ever devised for humanity because it works on average. Use it and stay away from the cacophony of scams out on social media from armchair experts. Okay, let's finish up with the last clip. Episode 49, Coaching the Endurance Athlete. Dr. Susan Sotir. She's a endurance sports coach with breakthrough performance coaching. She has a PhD in sport physiology and exercise psychology. She's also an assistant professor at Springfield College, former competitive college swimmer, Ironman triathlete. So she's got a wealth of not only qualifications, but hands-on experience. The clip that I chose is about the female athlete and the effects that menstruation, menopause, and perimenopause have on the female athlete in the training cycle, as well as things like nutrition or even things like race planning and race scheduling. I put a brief audiogram of this exchange out on social media, and people were just drawn to it. So I'm going to play that clip and then I'll come back with some comments. There's been, over the last few years, heightened awareness around this. Sure, you know, there was a book written a few years ago by a sports physiologist, Stacy Sims. She wrote a book, Roar, and it basically created sort of heightened awareness around female athletes. So I think her tagline is "Women are not small men. You know, women are different, so they should be trained different, coached different." And you know, behind that is this sort of the idea that most of the sports physiology research has been done on men, and because of that, it's not representative or completely representative for females. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. First, do you think that is what do you think about that position about the sports physiology research? Do you think it's valid, and are you doing anything specifically different with female athletes, whether it be around menstruation or female athlete triad awareness, menopause, perimenopause, things like that?
So she brought attention to something that has been a conversation in the sport and exercise physiology world for a long time. The biggest pool of available research subjects in colleges are college-age students. And because of that menstrual cycle and the fluctuations of it, researchers didn't want to have to figure out how to work with that. So college-age men primarily have made up the subjects for sport physiology research since they started doing sport physiology research. Stacey Sims did a phenomenal job, not only writing that book, but promoting that book and getting that information out there and getting more people to pick it up. Mm-hmm. Where the nuance gets lost is that the research studies that are cited in ROAR, all of her information is accurate. Where it fails to communicate nuance is that all of that information is based on averages.
Right.
So anytime we're talking about research findings that are summarized findings, we're talking about averages. So the idea of the 28-day cycle, well, that's an average. Some women are going to have a much shorter cycle. Some people are going to have a longer cycle. So that cycle is much more variable. Right. And the differences and distinctions between the sort of physiological characteristics of the follicular stage versus the luteal stage, again, are going to be nuanced based on the individual.
Right.
So kind of how we actually spent an entire day on just talking about this topic with our coaching staff. We do a coaches education day fairly regularly, but we do it a 10-hour day at least once a year where we really dive deep on something. And we dove deep on this. And how we framed it was, all right, what factors affect endurance performance? And if we're talking about that, well, it's your preparation, your training, your specificity, your adaptations,
right,
your ability to maintain temperature, so cooling, sweating, circulation, your fueling, including fuel availability, ventilation, contractile proteins, all that sort of stuff, execution of your work. So that's comfort, psychological effects, confidence, those pieces, and then your equipment. And when you look at it through the lens of where can the menstrual cycle have an impact, well, really, it's pretty much everything but equipment. And then that means we have to actually work with our athletes individually to understand what their effects actually are. Mm-hmm. There are some people who are extremely impacted by a higher temperature onset of sweating in the follicular stage, in those days before menses start. Well, for them, we need very specific cooling strategies. We need pre-cooling. We need during race cooling. We need temperature maintaining strategies for those folks. Other folks, it doesn't bother them. So it's like, all right, well, we're not going to spend all your energy doing this. Let's spend your energy on things that do bother you. And then when you're looking at fueling, same thing. What can somebody tolerate? And I think one of the pieces that Stacey Sims really highlighted in that book was, as you get older, you have more difficulties taking in your fuel as fluid, and it's easier for you to take it in as food. And you are also going to have more challenges with fructose or fruit sugars. Well, okay, great. So if we know this with somebody who is an athlete who's approaching menopause or in perimenopause or in menopause, well, then we have to make sure we give them a number of trial runs at their fueling plan and do it under stressful conditions and make sure they're fatigued going into it, make sure it's warm, really offering a number of race rehearsals so that those pieces can be ironed out. And when we're thinking about this topic, the other piece we have to really talk about is the idea of birth control and hormonal versus non-hormonal birth controls, because those are not typical cycles. So you're not going to have the same hormonal responses, but you're going to have side effects potentially from the type of birth control you're on. So it has to be part of the conversation.
Right.
And what's really interesting with the group I coach with is there's nobody who coaches just one sex. We all have athletes of both sexes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we all have to be able to have conversations that maybe aren't our first instinctive, comfortable conversations.
That's true.
But
yeah.
if we're gonna prepare a person for something that they are really striving for, then our comfort really has to not matter very much. What matters is, are they prepared? Can they cool themselves? Can they fuel themselves? Can they execute? And can they do it as well as possible on the day that they're given?
Great conversation with Susan Sotir. Go to the show notes. You'll find the link to the full conversation. We talk about other things, psychology, swimming, things like that. But this topic is particularly interesting because it's been in the news over the last few years, and there's always something new. The recent systematic review, the scientists involved in this study, Lauren Colenso Semple, Stuart Phillips, Kirstie Elliott Sale, some of the questions they tackled: is there evidence to support menstrual cycle-based training? And if there is evidence, how should training differ in different phases of the menstrual cycle? They tackle the question of oral contraception, and are these recommendations different for women who use oral contraception? They tackle tracking devices. How accurate are the tracking devices? And so I won't go into all of the details here, but you can definitely go look up the study. Very interesting topic, and I'm always now more than ever looking to make sure that I can intelligently articulate some of the new research in this space. And by the way, that study that I mentioned is in Frontiers in Sport Active Living, Volume 5, 2023. I knew a bit about the topic going into the conversation. I think one of the things that I got out of the exchange with Dr. Sotir is much of the question of what do you do with female athletes and menstruation in the training cycle, in the race scheduling process, should be highly individualized. The other thing that dawned on me with the exchange was that people seem to systematically neglect the effects or potential effects that menstruation has on female athletes. I mean, something as simple as what happens when your period falls on your race week or your race day is something that male athletes just don't have to contend with. We need to do more just to simply acknowledge this and also reduce all of the stigma around it. I'll finish up with another real-world example that happened probably within the last days. So there's a professional triathlete by the name of Emma Pallant. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And a photographer posted a picture of her in a triathlon. I believe it was on Instagram. And let's just say the picture was a near full body picture, or really stopped at her knee. But you could see in the picture, triathletes' kits, what they call the racing kit, especially with the pro triathletes in hot weather. They're very revealing sometimes. And you can see in the picture that she is having her period. And so someone commented on the picture. I don't know who posted it. Someone commented on the picture and said, I'm reading it here, not the most flattering picture of Emma Pallant. Surely you can crop it a bit better. Emma Pallant sees the comment and responds, and this is what she says. She responds to the person, thanks for caring, but definitely something I'm not shy to talk about because it's the reality of females in sport. My period comes over a month in between, and there will be one day where it is super heavy. I pray it won't be race day, but every now and then it is. No matter what tampon I have experimented with, for anything over 3 hours, it's too heavy. So just as someone might get gut issues in a race, I have to suck it up and give what I have and not be afraid to talk to women who have the same problem. And she gives the 2 hands up emoji. All right, so those were the top 5 most listened to and downloaded episodes of Season 5. And it's about time that I wrap this up. You can absolutely go out and listen to some of the other ones. There were some other ones that were pretty close and well downloaded as well. My episode with Dave McGilvery, race director of the Boston Marathon, that was in Season 5. Had a podcast with open water swimming Olympian Alex Meyer. Had a podcast on nil and pay for play and the legacy of Title IX with Dr. Jill Harris and Dr. Nola Aga. Had another podcast on hypnotism for athlete performance with Mike Mandel and Chris Thompson. So I hope I've given you some things that made you think and were very interesting in the sea of podcasts that are out there. And I will follow up very soon with the first episode of the Endurance Experience Podcast, Season 6. It's coming real soon. And I got some great podcasts lined up. So look for that to follow pretty soon over the coming weeks.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.